The book of Leviticus begins with the word "and." It's a very small word, but has a very big meaning. It's a transition word. It means the story continues. Well, where did the story leave off? Exodus chapter 40 and verse 34, the Lord's presence descends and moves into the tabernacle. And the book of Leviticus picks off from that. And so simply put, the book of Leviticus is about how do we approach God who moved into the holy tent next door? How do we approach him? And in the first 7 chapters, it covers the offerings, covers the burnt offering, the trespass offering, guilt offering, peace offering, and other offerings. And in chapters 6 and 7, it gives instructions for the priests on how they are to do these offerings. And then chapters 8 through 9 records the consecration of the priests, where Aaron receives his clothing, and each piece of his clothing is very significant, has a very deep theological meaning to it, and which points to Christ, our high priest today. And in chapter 9, at the end of chapter 8, it records the 7-day consecration where the priests spent 7 days in the tabernacle, completely away from the world, just spending time with God, getting ready for the work that they were about to do. And then chapter 9 ends. If we go to chapter 9, verse 22, Leviticus 9, verse 22, says, "And Aaron lifted up his hand toward the people and blessed them, and came down from offering of the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle of the congregation and came out and blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared unto all the people." So Aaron and Moses, they bring this blessing. But then God confirms that he puts his sign of approval on this in verse 24. "And there came a fire out from before the Lord, and it consumed upon the burnt offering, upon the altar, the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted and fell on their face." So you have this chapters 8 and 9, the consecration of the priests, and it's leading up to this very special moment at the end of chapter 9 where God strikes fire upon the altar and he burns it. It burns the burnt offering and the fat, and these people are joyful and they fall on their faces in reverence to God. So there's this mountaintop moment for Israel, and almost a roller coaster of a story. The next 2 verses shows a completely different story. And in chapter 10, verse 1, it says, "And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer, and put fire therein, and put incense thereon, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord." So the end of chapter 9, fire comes from heaven and devours the sacrifice. Chapters 10, verses 1 through 2, fire comes from heaven and devours the sacrificers. So what was the difference? The difference was obedience and disobedience. You see, pleasing sacrifice in God's eyes is when we follow his commands. Yes, God wants us to worship him with our spirit, that being our hearts. He wants us to be devoted and to worship him from our hearts. But also we need to ensure that we are following God's commands for how we are to worship him. because we want God to consume that sacrifice, not the sacrificers. So chapter 10, I want us to focus on the cost of disobedience. There's 3 commands in this chapter that God gives to the priest, and the cost of disobedience for each of those commands is death. And as an overview, the first one was what we read in chapters 1 through 2, or verses 1 through 2. The second one is going to be in verse 6 when God says, don't uncover your heads, don't rend your clothes. We'll touch on more of that later. And then verse 9 commands them to not drink wine or strong drink. The cost of disobedience for each of those commands was death. The same holy God who accepted obedient worship in chapter 9, judge unauthorized worship in chapter 10, reminds us that we need to follow God's commands. So God commanded the priest, number 1, do not offer strange fire. God did command the priests which fire to use. This was likely fire from the altar of burnt offering. As later passages strongly suggest this principle. For example, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest was specifically commanded to take coals, quote, from off the altar before the Lord, end quote, Leviticus 16 and verse 12. Nadab and Abihu offered fire that was acquired from somewhere else other than the fire God specified them to get. So likely the fire they were supposed to get was from the altar of burnt offering. So we can infer that they got this fire from somewhere else, and they went and offered that, likely in the altar of incense, which was in the holy place. So the most important lesson from these verses is that the command to not offer strange fire was an implicit command, meaning that it was implied. It wasn't an explicit command. God never explicitly told them, do not offer strange fire. But it was an implicit command, right? God, he recognizes that we are intellectual, that we have our minds and we are able to reason. God does not, if God listed all the thou shalt nots, the Bible would be unreadable. It would be way too long to read, right? God told them which fire to use. So that excluded every other fire. They were not to use any other type of fire, right? It's implied whenever you say, I want you to use this fire. The implication is every other type of fire you're not to use, right? So God's people are not only to follow God's explicit commands. Yes, we are to follow those commands that God says, you shall do this, or you shall not do this. But as God's people, we are to follow God's implicit commands too. We're also to follow God's inspired examples that are binding on us today. An example of this is Acts 20 and verse 7. The disciples came together on the first day of the week to break bread. Nowhere in the Bible does it say, we Christians, we command you on the first day of every week to partake of the Lord's Supper. Nowhere in the Bible does it explicitly say that. But we are still bound by that command to do that. Why? Because it is a binding example from Acts 20 and verse 7. And if you think about our worship today, why do we only sing in our worship? Why do we not have a band right? Why do we not have mechanical instruments? It's because the implication, whenever God in Colossians 3:16, whenever it says to sing and make melody in your heart to the Lord, the explicit command is to sing. How do you do that? By making melody in your heart to the Lord. So the explicit command, sing. How do you do that? Make melody in your heart to the Lord. So the inference, the implication is that any other type of music is prohibited. That's why we don't use mechanical instruments in worship. It's not because God explicitly says, thou shalt not use mechanical instruments in worship. It's because he told us what kind of music we are to use in worship, so that it automatically excludes every other type of music in worship. That's what Nadab and Abihu failed to recognize. They failed to recognize God's implicit commands. So today when we look at the religious world and we say, they're doing this wrong, they're doing that wrong, we can't turn in the Bible and say, well, it specifically says, thou shalt not do this. It's because they have failed to recognize God's implicit commands. And as God's people, God's implicit commands, the binding examples that we find from the apostles and the disciples, are just as binding as the explicit commands. You know, we understand this principle from drugs, right? Nowhere in the Bible does it explicitly say, thou shalt not use heroin, or thou shalt not use smoke marijuana. But we understand the implication from verses that talk about drunkenness and inebriation. The implication is that we're to be, well, it does explicitly say that we are to be sober, right? But the implication is that we're not to use substances that are to inebriate ourselves, right? So the important lesson from verses 1 through 2 is that God's implicit commands are just as binding as his explicit commands. Nadab and Abihu failed to recognize that, and the cost of disobedience was death. Today, if we fail to recognize God's implicit commands, the cost of disobedience is an eternal death in hell. The second command that God gave the priest, the second command was, do not uncover your heads. This comes from Leviticus chapter 10, verse 6. Let's start at verse 4, though. Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 4. It says, and Moses called Mishael and Elizaphan, the sons of Uzziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said unto them, come near, carry your brethren from before the sanctuary out of the camp. So they went near and carried them in their coats out of the camp. And Moses said unto Aaron, and unto Eleazar, and unto Ithamar his sons, uncover not your heads, neither rend your clothes, lest ye die, and lest wrath come upon all the people. But let all your brethren and the whole house of Israel bewail the burning which the Lord hath kindled. So the second command in chapter 10, uncover not your heads, neither rend your clothes, lest ye die. So Moses commanded Aaron and his sons to not mourn Nadab and Abihu's death. They were commanded to not uncover their heads, rend their clothes, which in that culture were signs of mourning, right? If they did do that, then Moses said that they would die. And so the lesson we can learn is those who serve God must submit to his judgment, even whenever it is painful. Nadab and Abihu's death was a righteous judgment from God. Public mourning by the priest could appear to challenge or protest God's judgment. Those who minister before God must honor his holiness, even in difficult moments. I mean, Nadab and Abihu, these were the very sons of Aaron. And Moses is telling them, don't uncover your head, don't rend your clothes, right? To us, it almost seems like, well, he's telling them not even to mourn his own son's death. That's kind of harsh, right? But what God is saying is, I want if you are going to be of God, you have to be in agreement with his judgments. We have to be in agreement with God's judgments, even if it involves those we love most, even if our emotions struggle to accept it, even when it condemns family, friends, or even ourselves, even when his standards are unpopular, even when the consequences are painful, even when society rejects it, we still have to accept the judgments of God. So, for example, last week we talked about church discipline, right? And in Bible class we discussed, what if it's your family? That's something that's very emotional. That's something that's very painful. But we still have to be in agreement with God's judgments, right? In Matthew 18:20, Christ withdrew his fellowship. So we're to be in agreement with God's judgments. What about capital punishment? A lot of people today they advocate to eliminate capital punishment, right? In Romans chapter 13, it says that the government is ordained of God. And it also says that they do not bear the sword in vain, right? So we are to submit to the judgments of God. And one way that God enacts judgment today is through the government. And in the Old Testament, there are plenty of examples of capital punishment directly instituted by God, right? So today, I would say that those who advocate for who do not advocate for capital punishment are rejecting God's judgments. And you think about maybe something today like wars, right? I understand not all wars are necessarily ethical. Not all wars are done for necessarily the right reason, right? But again, in Romans chapter 13, it says that the government is ordained of God and does not bear the sword in vain. So God does use governments, he does use nations to enact his judgment. We can see that all throughout the Old Testament, where God's people were in sin, and with Israel, for example, he destroyed them with the nation of Assyria. So that was a righteous judgment from God. And with Judah, he carried them away in Babylonian captivity, destroyed the temple, right? And even in AD 70 with the nation of Israel, God completely wiped out the religion of Judaism and the nation of Israel and Judah. So we have to be in agreement with God's judgments. And if we go to 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 2, 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 2. This is one of those verses that you read in the Bible and it's sort of confusing, and I'm not saying I have the answer to it, but I have my own judgment upon this verse. So in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 2, it says, Do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world? What does that mean? Are we actually going to judge the world? What I think this verse is saying is that we have to be in agreement with God's judgment on the judgment day, right? On the judgment day, there are going to be people whom we love, people who were our friends or even our family who maybe weren't Christians, did not obey the gospel or did not live faithfully. Well, on the judgment day, we have to, exactly what happened here in Leviticus. We can't uncover our heads or rend our clothes. We have to be in agreement with God's judgment. When God judges, we must be in agreement with his judgment. The third command that God gave to the priests was to do not drink strong drink. So in Leviticus chapter 10, if we want to go back to Leviticus 10, and let's start at verse 8. Leviticus 10 and verse 8. It says, "And the Lord spake unto Aaron, saying, Do not drink wine, nor strong drink, thou nor thy sons with thee, when ye go into the tabernacle of the congregation, lest ye die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. And that ye may put difference between holy and unholy, and difference between clean and unclean." So Moses commanded the priests to not drink wine or strong drink. In this context, wine is referring to the fermented juice of grapes. So this was alcoholic wine. And something that you have to keep in mind is that not every time you see that word wine in the Bible is it talking about alcoholic wine, right? In the Hebrew and in the Greek, there's only one word for wine, and it could either be talking about a fermented wine or unfermented wine. You just have to look at the context. And even in, for example, the King James Bible, the archaic language of the word wine, if you look at, say, a dictionary from the 1600s, 1700s, and you look at the word wine, it could either refer to a fermented grape or freshly pressed grape, right? And in our modern translations, it has adopted that where it doesn't, it just says wine. So you have to look at the context. Okay, is it talking about unfermented or fermented wine, right? But we understand today, right, in the passages when the Lord has instituted the Lord's Supper, and he is talking about, the wine. Well, we understand that's not alcoholic wine. We understand that that's grape juice, right? So you just have to look at the context. But here in Leviticus 10, it is talking about alcoholic wine. And it also mentions strong drink. Now, in the Old Testament, anytime you see strong drink, today we usually associate strong drink with maybe a more hard liquor. But it's actually what today we would think about as beer. It would be like a beer or a date drink. So this command, something else that's interesting is that this command was given right after the incident of Nadab and Abihu offering the strange fire. So it might suggest that Nadab and Abihu were under the influence whenever they offered the strange fire. Maybe that's why they offered the strange fire. They were under the influence. They did not have the right judgment to understand what they were doing, right? And so the alcohol may have been a contributing factor from impairing their judgment and offering strange fire. And today, whenever you look at the typology, meaning by typology, I mean in the Old Testament, you had shadows that pointed to the actual thing, types that pointed to the antitypes, right? If you look at the typology, right, today, 1 Peter 2, verse 9, all Christians are priests, right? In the Old Testament, everyone was forbidden from drinking alcohol, but specifically, it talks about the priests, right? It says, when you go into the tabernacle of the congregation, or do not drink wine nor strong drink, when you go into the tabernacle of the congregation. So today, all Christians are priests. We dwell in the holy place, which is the church of Christ, That is our dwelling 24/7. So even if you just look at the typology, alcohol is completely forbidden for those within the church. And so the Bible condemns drunkenness, but it does not just condemn drunkenness. It condemns any recreational consumption of alcohol. A good verse to support this is 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3. So let's go to 1 Peter 4:3. In 1 Peter 4, verse 3, it says, "For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries." The three phrases I want us to focus in this verse is excess of wine, revelings, and banquetings. Now, each of those words refer to an occasion where alcohol was present. And so we understand, with synonyms, right? We understand with synonyms, there are words that are similar, but they're not necessarily an exact equivalent, right? So in this verse, it says the excess of wine, the revelings, the banquetings. Excess of wine, that would have been what we think today as a drunkenness. The revelings, that would have been today what we think of like a wild party where alcohol is present. And then the banquetings, today we would probably think about maybe a social drinking occasion. So I kind of want to break down each of these words. And whenever it says excess of wine, that's one word in the Greek. It's the word oinophleugia. So excess, and it's actually in the plural, so it would probably sound more like excesses of wine. But that's not how we talk in English, so it's not translated that way. So this word stresses the amount consumed and resulting in intoxication. So this verse is condemning drunkenness, right? The second word, revelings, this comes from the Greek word komos, and it describes the party-like riotous atmosphere associated with drinking. So the Bible condemns wild parties where alcohol is present. And then this third word, banquetings, more modern translations are going to render it as drinking parties. It comes from the Greek word potos. And this is a general term for a drinking occasion, but it's broader than drunkenness. It implies that the act of drinking itself is the subject of the prohibition. So if you look at history and you look at the usage of this word, apotos, right? There would, and you look at, getting a little bit nerdy here, but like in the book of Ecclesiastes, right? It talks about it's better go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. And you look at the Septuagint and it's that same word, potos, right? So when this word is used, it's referring to an occasion where alcohol was present. It's sort of like a banquet type environment where there's alcohol present, but there's not necessarily drunkenness present. But the Bible in this verse, right, is condemning that. So those who advocate that a Christian today can drink but not get drunk, I would argue that there's no scriptural precedent for that. Another verse to support that idea would be Ephesians verse 5 and verse 19. So let's go over there. Ephesians 5, I said verse 19, but I meant verse 18. Ephesians 5, verse 18, it says, "And be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. That phrase, be not drunk, it's one word in the Greek, methusko, and it is an inceptive verb. So what it means is do not even begin the process of drunkenness. How do you begin the process of drunkenness? Take that first drink, right? Do not even begin the process of drunkenness, right? So any recreational consumption of alcohol is condemned in the Bible. Another verse to support this, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 23. 1 Peter 5:23. It says, drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake, and for thy often infirmities. So the fact that Paul commanded Timothy to consume alcoholic wine for medicinal purposes implies that Timothy's abstinence from alcoholic wine was the standard, right? So his standard was to completely abstain from alcoholic wine, right? He knew that, hey, that's wrong, that's wrong. And Paul is commanding him, hey, look, right, for medicinal purposes, you can consume this, right? We understand today that if someone uses drugs, not recreationally, but medically, that, we don't see anything wrong with that, right? We understand that today, right? So the medicinal use of drugs is not condemned in the scriptures. The recreational use of drugs in scripture is condemned. If we go to the book of Proverbs, it has a lot to talk about the subject of alcohol. So let's go to Proverbs chapter 20. Proverbs 20, it'll be the first verse. Proverbs 20, verse 1. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Another verse would be Proverbs 23, and then at the end of that chapter, verse 29. So Proverbs 23, and starting at verse 29, says, who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? And who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine, they that seek mixed wine. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth color, his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder. Thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thine heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea, or as he that lieth upon the top of a mass. They have stricken me. Shalt thou say, and I was not sick? They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I awake? I will seek it yet again. Very descriptive text of the process of drunkenness, where this person, is drunk and he's being beaten and he doesn't even feel it. We understand that drugs can have a numbing effect, right? So a very accurate description of someone who's drunk. And obviously the Bible is condemning that sort of behavior. Another verse in Proverbs 31, and verses starting at verse 4. Proverbs 31 and verse 4. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted, so that inebriation affecting the mind's judgment. In verse 6, in my judgment, this is sort of like a sarcasm. It says, give strong drink unto them that are perishing, right? So he's saying it's not for kings to drink wine or strong drink. If you're going to give strong drink to someone, give it to someone who is perishing, not a king. So when this discussion comes up, people who advocate for social drinking or drinking in moderate amounts, they will point to John chapter 2, where Jesus performs the miracle in Cana of Galilee, and he turns the water into wine. Again, whenever you see that word wine, you have to look at the context. Is it talking about the freshly pressed grape juice, or is it talking about something that has been fermented? Now, if Jesus turned this water into wine, he would have been a sinner. Into alcoholic wine, he would have been a sinner. Habakkuk 2:15, it says, woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink. So if Jesus turned, if you look at the amount that he converted to water and to wine, it would have been about 120 to 150 gallons of wine that was turned from water. And if he gave it to people in John chapter 10 and verse 9, it says that these people had already been well drunk. It's not talking about drunkenness, it's talking about they've been filled, right? Right. So if he gave 120 to 150 gallons, theoretically speaking, of alcoholic wine to people who had already been well drunk, would not Jesus have been a sinner? Well, those who advocate for consumption of alcohol moderately, I don't know how they use this passage to support their proposition, because if Jesus would have done that, he would have been a sinner. So in that context, in John chapter 2, it is unfermented wine, non-alcoholic wine. So any recreational consumption of alcohol, the scriptures condemn, and the cost of disobedience is death. Leviticus 10 reminds us that God is holy, and those who approach him must obey him. Nadab and Abihu failed to recognize God's implicit commands, and they died because of it. Today, as God's people, we have to recognize not only God's implicit commands, but his implicit commands and the binding examples we find in the scriptures. And Aaron and his sons, the priests, were commanded to submit to God's judgment even whenever it was painful. Told them to not uncover their heads and not rend their clothes, but to be in agreement with God's judgment even whenever it was hard. And then the priests were forbidden from drinking wine and strong drink, because those who serve God must possess clear judgment and discernment. Every chapter, or every section of this chapter, it teaches us a lesson. There was those 3 commands that were given to the priests, and the cost of disobedience for each of those commands was death. Today, the cost of disobedience is not physical death at an altar, but eternal separation and eternal death from God. In 2 Thessalonians 1, 7-9, says that those who do not obey the gospel, that Jesus Christ is going to come back in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those people who do not know God and those who do not obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. The cost of disobedience today is that eternal death. Maybe you're here today and you've never obeyed the gospel. The gospel, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1-4, is the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. How do you obey that gospel? You die to your old man of sin. You're buried with Christ in baptism. That's where you contact his blood as he shed his blood in death. And then you rise up to walk in newness of life. If you're a Christian, you're not walking in newness of life, you're not living faithfully, then we ask you to change that. So if there is a need today to respond to the invitation, I'll be up here. You can come up front and sit with me. We can have a conversation about it. And so if there's a need, we expect you to come as we stand, as we sing.